The clinking of handcuffs echoed sharply in the park's serene atmosphere, silencing the distant laughter of children and the gentle rustle of leaves. Marcus Davis, calm and composed, stood by the patrol car as Officer Brian Harkin secured his wrists with practiced efficiency. The metal cuffs bit into Marcus's skin, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he kept his gaze forward, his expression unreadable. "Name?" Brian asked, his voice clipped and impatient as he reached for his notebook. "Marcus Davis," came the reply, steady and unbothered. Brian's eyes narrowed. "You're a suspect in a series of recent crimes. Tall, black, mid-40s. It all fits." Marcus raised an eyebrow, the faintest trace of disbelief flashing across his face. "So I'm being arrested for sitting in a park and reading a book?" Brian's jaw tightened. "You're being detained because you fit the description." The accusation hung heavy in the air. Around them, curious onlookers slowed their pace, their whispers blending with the low hum of the city. Marcus didn't argue. He knew the futility of words against a badge and authority wielded without care. But he also knew something Brian didn't, that this arrest would lead to an outcome the officer would never see coming. As Marcus was guided into the backseat of the patrol car, Brian couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The man in his custody wasn't acting the way suspects usually did. There was no resistance, no panic, just a calmness that felt unnerving, as if Marcus knew something Brian didn't. The car door slammed shut, punctuating the officer's determination to maintain control. But as he drove toward the precinct, Brian's mind wandered. Who was Marcus Davis? Really? Why didn't he fight back? And why? In the pit of his stomach, did this feel like the beginning of something he wasn't prepared for? Unbeknownst to Brian, the answer was waiting for him at the precinct, a revelation that would turn this routine arrest into a career-defining moment. One that would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew. The precinct hummed with its usual buzz, phones ringing, officers moving purposefully, and the low murmur of conversations. As Officer Brian Harkin guided Marcus Davis through the front doors, a few heads turned, their curiosity barely hidden. To them, it was just another arrest in a city filled with them. But for Marcus, it was a moment he had experienced too many times before. "Let's get you processed," Brian said tersely, his grip firm on Marcus's arm. Marcus didn't resist. He walked calmly, his sharp eyes taking in the precinct. His expression remained composed, but his mind was already calculating his next steps. At the booking desk, Officer Jenkins, a young and eager recruit, looked up from his computer. His gaze flicked between Marcus and Brian, the faintest hint of recognition sparking in his eyes. "What's the charge?" Jenkins asked, pulling a clipboard closer. "Suspicious activity," Brian replied curtly, his tone brooking no argument. He handed over Marcus's ID without glancing at it. Jenkins studied the name, his brow furrowing slightly. He hesitated, the recognition growing more apparent. "Davis, Marcus Davis," Jenkins repeated, his voice just above a whisper. He quickly masked his reaction, but not before Marcus caught it. A flicker of understanding passed between them, unspoken but clear. "Captain Bennett will want to see this," Jenkins added, handing back the ID. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled ever so slightly as he typed into his computer. Brian, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension, nodded sharply and tugged Marcus toward the captain's office. Marcus allowed himself a brief glance at Jenkins before moving. That glance said everything. "You know who I am. Let's see how this plays out." The walk to Captain Bennett's office was filled with the heavy echo of their footsteps on the tiled floor. Brian's grip remained firm, his confidence unshaken, but Marcus could sense his unease, hidden behind the officer's stiff posture. It wasn't the first time Marcus had encountered someone like Brian, someone who saw only what they expected to see. Captain Bennett's office door stood ajar. Inside, she sat at her desk, her head bent over paperwork. She looked up at the sound of their approach, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly as they fell on Marcus. She rose, her movements precise and commanding, and waved them in. "Officer Harkin," she said, her voice neutral. "What do we have here?" "Suspicious activity in the park," Brian said, his tone firm but lacking its earlier conviction. This guy refused to cooperate. Bennett's gaze shifted to Marcus. Her expression unreadable. There was no question that she recognized him. The subtle stiffening of her shoulders and the flicker of surprise in her eyes said it all. But she didn't show her hand. Not yet. Is that so? She asked. Her tone cool as she motioned for Marcus to sit. Marcus met her gaze. Calm but pointed, he took the offered seat. His composure unshaken. Apparently, reading in the park now qualifies as suspicious activity. Bennett didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied Marcus for a moment longer before turning her attention to Brian. Step outside. Officer Harkin, I'd like a moment alone with Mr. Davis. Brian hesitated, confusion clouding his face. Captain, now, she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. As Brian stepped out, Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. He could see the storm brewing in Bennett's mind and knew the tide was about to turn as the door clicked shut behind Officer Brian Harkin. Captain Laura Bennett leaned forward, her hands clasped lightly on her desk. Her sharp eyes remained fixed on Marcus Davis, searching for signs of tension or anger. Instead, she found only calm resolve, an unshakable confidence that made her pause. Mr. Davis, she began, her voice measured, I owe you an apology for the misunderstanding. I know who you are. Marcus offered a small, knowing smile. Captain Bennett, I appreciate the gesture, but I think we both know that this isn't just a misunderstanding. Bennett's expression shifted slightly, her professional demeanor softening just enough to reveal a glimmer of regret. You're right, it's not, but it's also not every day that an FBI agent is mistaken for a suspect and brought into my precinct. Or treated like a criminal in a public park. Marcus interjected, his tone even but laced with meaning. That's the part that concerns me. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Marcus's words settling between them. Bennett glanced at the door, as if to ensure no one was listening, then turned her focus back to Marcus. Why didn't you identify yourself to Officer Harkin? She asked. Genuinely curious. It would have avoided all of this. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. Because I shouldn't have to. My job title shouldn't be the reason someone treats me with respect. If I were anyone else sitting in that park, the outcome should have been the same, a peaceful afternoon, not an unnecessary confrontation. Bennett nodded slowly, her respect for Marcus deepening. That's fair, and unfortunately, it highlights a bigger problem. A problem your precinct now has the opportunity to address. Marcus added, his voice firm but not unkind. I didn't come here to cause trouble, Captain, but I won't ignore what happened either. Bennett exhaled, the weight of her responsibilities pressing heavily on her shoulders. You're putting me in a difficult position, Mr. Davis, but you're not wrong. The system needs to be better, and this incident makes that painfully clear. Marcus leaned back, his expression softening. I'm not here to make your job harder, Captain. I'm here to ensure this doesn't happen to someone else. Accountability isn't about punishment, it's about growth. A knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Bennett straightened as she called. Come in. Officer Harkin stepped in, his face flushed with a mixture of confusion and frustration. He glanced between Marcus and Bennett, clearly uneasy. Captain, Bennett gestured for him to close the door. Officer Harkin, we need to talk. Brian's grip on the folder in his hand tightened. I was just following protocol, he said defensively. I had no way of knowing. That's precisely the issue. Bennett cut him off, her tone firm. Your actions were based on assumptions, not facts, and that's a problem. Marcus remained silent, observing the exchange with calm intensity. Brian's posture shifted slightly, his confidence beginning to waver under Bennett's pointed scrutiny. You're going to need to take some time to reflect on what happened. Bennett continued, her voice steady but resolute, and we'll be conducting a full review of your actions. Brian's eyes flicked toward Marcus, the weight of his mistake becoming harder to ignore. For the first time, his bravado cracked, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Understood, Captain, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Bennett nodded, her focus shifting back to Marcus. "Mr. Davis, thank you for your patience. We'll handle this properly." Marcus rose from his chair, his movements deliberate. "I trust that you will, Captain. I'll be watching." Brian Harkin sat stiffly in the waiting area outside Captain Bennett's office. His mind raced, replaying every moment of his encounter with Marcus Davis. The weight of Bennett's stern words still echoed in his ears. Assumptions, not facts. It was a damning observation, and no matter how he tried to rationalize his actions, he couldn't shake the gnawing guilt that had started to settle deep in his chest. The door to the office opened, and Officer Jenkins stepped out, giving Brian a brief nod. "She'll see you now." Brian rose slowly, his body heavy with apprehension. He stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. Captain Bennett sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable. The air between them was thick with tension, but it wasn't anger, there was something else. Disappointment. "Take a seat, Officer Harkin," Bennett said, her tone calm but firm. Brian sat down, avoiding her gaze. His palms rested flat on his thighs, his fingers twitching slightly. "Captain, Bennett raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Not yet. I need you to listen first." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Do you understand the gravity of what happened yesterday?" Bennett began, leaning forward slightly. "You arrested a man with no substantial evidence. Your reasoning was based on a vague description and, let's be honest, your own biases." Brian flinched at the word, but he didn't interrupt. "Marcus Davis is not just an FBI agent," Bennett continued. "He's a respected figure, someone who has spent years upholding justice. And yet, yesterday, you treated him as if he were a criminal based solely on how he looked." "I didn't mean to." Brian's voice faltered, the words sounding hollow even to him. "That doesn't change the impact of your actions," Bennett said sharply. "Intentions don't erase the consequences." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Brian shifted in his seat, the weight of Bennett's gaze pressing down on him. Finally, he found the courage to speak. "I've been on this force for over 20 years," he said quietly. "I've always tried to do what's right, to protect the community. And yet, yesterday, you failed that community." Bennett replied, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. "This isn't about one mistake, Brian. It's about recognizing why that mistake happened and taking responsibility for it." Brian nodded slowly, the truth of her words sinking in. "I don't know how to fix this. It starts with accountability," Bennett said simply. "You need to own what happened, reflect on it, and be willing to change." There was a knock at the door, and Marcus Davis stepped in. His presence immediately filled the room with an air of calm authority. He nodded at Bennett before turning his attention to Brian. "Officer Harkin," Marcus began, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not here to hold grudges. I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. Do you understand the importance of that?" Brian met his gaze, and for the first time, he didn't feel defensive. He felt exposed, vulnerable. "I do," he said softly. "I do now." Marcus nodded. "Then let's make sure we move forward in the right way." Brian Harkin sat in the precinct's break room, the lukewarm coffee in his hand doing little to settle his nerves. The walls felt closer than usual, the hum of conversations around him more distant, despite the hours that had passed since the meeting with Captain Bennett and Marcus Davis. Their words echoed in his mind, relentless in their clarity. Every sip of coffee tasted bitter, not from the brew, but from the truth he had been forced to face. Across the precinct, Marcus Davis was in the midst of another conversation, this time with a group of officers participating in a scheduled training session. Captain Bennett had invited Marcus to share his perspective, emphasizing the importance of de-escalation techniques and implicit bias training. Marcus stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding yet approachable. He spoke with a calm conviction, detailing his experience and the broader implications it carried. "I've worked with law enforcement my entire career," Marcus began, his tone steady, his eyes scanning the room. "I know the pressures you all face, the decisions you have to make in a split second. But we cannot allow those pressures to justify actions rooted in assumptions. The officers in the room listened intently. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, their expressions ranging from thoughtful to defensive. Marcus continued, undeterred. Being a law enforcement officer is one of the most challenging jobs in the world. He said, but it's also one of the most important. What you do matters, every single day. And the trust between you and the community you serve is what allows you to do your job effectively. That trust is fragile, and it's our responsibility to protect it. Meanwhile, Brian lingered near the doorway of the training room. Drawn by Marcus's words, he stood out of sight, his chest tightening with every sentence. He wasn't part of this session, but he felt compelled to hear Marcus out. Each word felt like a mirror, forcing Brian to confront the man he thought he was and the man he needed to become. As Marcus finished his talk, he opened the floor to questions. A young officer raised her hand. Agent Davis, she began hesitantly, how do you suggest we balance trusting our instincts with ensuring we don't let biases cloud our judgment? Marcus smiled gently, appreciating the honesty behind the question. Your instincts are valuable, he replied. They're shaped by experience and training. But instincts must be tempered by awareness. Ask yourself, what's driving this reaction? Is it evidence or something else? And if it's something else, take a step back. Brian felt a pang of recognition in those words. His instincts had been wrong, driven not by evidence but by bias. The memory of Marcus's calm, unyielding demeanor during their encounter in the park replayed in his mind. It wasn't defiance he had seen in Marcus's eyes, it was dignity. A quiet refusal to be reduced to a stereotype. After the session ended, Marcus stepped out into the hallway and immediately noticed Brian. There was no hostility in his gaze, only a quiet understanding. Officer Harkin, Marcus said evenly, I didn't expect to see you here. Brian shifted uncomfortably. I just wanted to hear what you had to say. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable, and Brian hesitated before speaking, his voice tinged with regret. You're right, about everything. I've been doing this job for a long time, and I thought I knew what it meant to serve and protect. But I see now that I've got a lot to learn. Marcus studied him for a moment before replying, acknowledging that is the first step. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. Brian nodded, the weight of his own words sinking in. Thank you for not giving up on us. I'm not here to give up, Marcus said simply. I'm here to help. Brian sat at his desk, the precinct bustling with its usual energy around him, but it all felt distant. The rhythmic tapping of keyboards, the hum of conversations, and even the occasional laughter faded into the background. His thoughts were elsewhere, locked in a cycle of regret and self-reflection. The weight of Marcus Davis's words lingered in his mind. Heavy and unyielding, they were a mirror, forcing Brian to confront parts of himself he had long avoided across the precinct. Captain Bennett was reviewing the latest developments in the investigation. She glanced over the witness statements and body cam footage again, the evidence reinforcing what she already knew. There was no excusing what had happened, but her concern extended beyond Brian's actions. This was a systemic issue, one that required more than disciplinary action. It demanded change, real, tangible reform. The phone on her desk buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Harper, her second in command. Captain, his voice came through steady but with an edge of urgency. Agent Davis is here. He's asked to speak with you. Send him in, Bennett replied, her tone measured. She straightened in her chair, preparing for the conversation. A moment later, Marcus entered her office. He carried himself with his usual calm, but there was a determination in his step that Bennett immediately noticed. She stood to greet him, extending a hand. Agent Davis, thank you for coming. Marcus shook her hand firmly, offering a polite nod. Captain Bennett, I appreciate you making time for me. They sat across from each other, the desk a symbolic boundary between their respective roles. What's on your mind? Bennett asked, folding her hands on the desk. Marcus's expression was serious but composed. I wanted to discuss the next steps. What happened with Officer Harkin is part of a larger issue. Addressing his actions is important, but it's not enough. The community needs to see more accountability, more transparency, and a commitment to doing better. Bennett nodded, her gaze unwavering. I agree, we've already begun implementing changes. But I know it's just the start. What would you suggest? Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but impassioned. Start with comprehensive training, not just a single session, but ongoing programs that address implicit bias, de-escalation, and cultural competency. Officers need tools to recognize their own biases and strategies to overcome them. That's already in the works, Bennett said, appreciating Marcus's insight. But it's clear we also need to rebuild trust. The community needs to know that we're not just paying lip service to change. Marcus nodded. That trust has to be earned through actions, not words. Engage the community directly, invite their input, listen to their concerns, and involve them in shaping policies. Show them that their voices matter. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Harper again, this time with Brian in tow. Bennett hesitated for a moment before gesturing for them to enter. Brian looked uneasy but determined, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I think we should all have this conversation together, Marcus suggested, his tone neutral. Bennett nodded, agreed. As Brian sat down, he glanced at Marcus, his gaze tinged with both remorse and respect. Agent Davis, he began, his voice uncertain, I owe you an apology. For everything. Marcus met Brian's eyes, his expression unreadable. Acknowledging your mistake is a start, Officer Harkin, but what matters now is what you do next. Brian swallowed hard, nodding, I want to learn, to do better. I know I can't change what happened, but I can change how I move forward. For the first time, a hint of approval crossed Marcus's face. That's all anyone can ask for. The room fell into a thoughtful silence, the air thick with the weight of the moment. It wasn't just about resolving a single incident. It was about setting a new precedent. The precinct conference room buzzed with tension as the internal review began. Brian sat at the table's end, his uniform crisp, but his face betrayed sleepless nights and relentless self-recrimination. Surrounding him were senior officers, representatives from Internal Affairs, and Marcus Davis, whose calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the storm brewing in Brian's mind. Captain Bennett led the proceedings, her voice steady but firm as she recounted the sequence of events. Each word landed heavily, stripping away any illusions Brian might have clung to. As she spoke, the room's atmosphere grew heavier, the weight of accountability pressing down on everyone present. Marcus was the first to speak after the review's opening remarks. His voice, even and deliberate, cut through the tension like a blade. This isn't just about one officer's actions. It's about the system that allowed those actions to happen. Accountability is necessary, but so is change. His words hung in the air, leaving Brian staring at his hands. When asked to respond, Brian's voice wavered. I see now how deeply I failed that day. Not just as an officer, but as a person. He looked up at Marcus, his eyes reflecting the turmoil inside. I'm sorry for what I did, for assuming, for escalating, for everything. Marcus didn't flinch, his expression unreadable. Acknowledging your mistakes is important, he replied, but it's what you do after this that will define you. The room remained silent as Brian's words settled. Internal Affairs asked pointed questions about his decision-making that day, each query a reminder of his errors. Brian answered honestly, though each response felt like peeling away a layer of his pride. Captain Bennett shifted the focus to future actions. This case isn't just about addressing Officer Harkin's behavior. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen again. We need to learn from this to rebuild trust within our community. The discussion turned to policy changes, with Marcus offering insights from his own experience in law enforcement. His calm, thoughtful suggestions carried weight, and even the most skeptical officials nodded in agreement. By the time the meeting ended, the room's tension had evolved into a shared determination. Brian, though still grappling with his mistakes, felt a faint glimmer of hope. Change was possible, even if it came at a cost in the days following the internal review. The precinct felt different. Conversations among officers became more reflective. laced with a quiet acknowledgement of the lessons from the incident. Meanwhile, Captain Bennett and Marcus worked tirelessly to lay the groundwork for meaningful reform. Their collaboration, though unexpected, grew stronger as they shared a common goal: to rebuild trust and foster change. Marcus returned to the precinct one morning, his presence commanding quiet respect. He moved through the halls, observing the shifts in energy. Officers greeted him with a mix of gratitude and hesitation, some visibly grappling with the aftermath of Brian's actions. Marcus carried himself with the same calm resolve, offering polite nods but steering clear of unnecessary confrontation. When he reached Bennett's office, she greeted him with a determined expression. "We've made progress," she began, sliding a document across her desk. "These are the updated training modules. They'll include mandatory sessions on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement." Marcus reviewed the material, his brow furrowed in thought. "This is a good start," he said, his tone encouraging but firm. "But these sessions need to go beyond theory. Officers need to understand the real-life implications of their actions, the ripple effects that extend far beyond a single encounter." Bennett nodded. "That's why I'm asking for your help. Your insights have already shaped this process, and having you involved in these sessions could make all the difference." Marcus hesitated, considering the weight of her request. He knew the importance of stepping forward, even when the path was fraught with resistance. "I'll do it," he said finally, "but we need to include voices from the community too. Their experiences are just as critical in shaping a new culture here." "Agreed," Bennett said, a rare smile breaking through her usual serious demeanor. "We'll make it happen." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Officer Jenkins stepped in, carrying a stack of files. "Captain, these are the feedback reports from the first set of workshops," he said, his eyes flickered toward Marcus with a hint of respect. "And Mr. Davis, thank you for your role in all of this. It's making an impact." Marcus acknowledged Jenkins with a nod. "Change is a collective effort," he replied. "It takes everyone." As Jenkins left, Bennett turned back to Marcus. "This precinct has a long way to go, but I think we're heading in the right direction." Marcus leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Change isn't easy," he said, "but if it's done right, it's worth every struggle." The precinct's conference room was quiet as Marcus prepared to address the first group of officers attending the new training program. A projector hummed softly, casting a muted glow across the room. The chairs were filled with officers, some shifting uncomfortably, others watching him intently. Marcus stood at the front, his posture relaxed but his expression resolute. "I'm not here to point fingers or place blame," he began, his voice even but carrying a weight that commanded attention. "I'm here to talk about what it means to serve a community and the responsibility that comes with wearing a badge." The room fell silent, the officers leaning in slightly as Marcus continued. He shared personal anecdotes, moments of triumph and frustration from his career in law enforcement, delivering them with raw honesty. His words weren't accusatory, but they carried a quiet authority that demanded reflection. "We all carry biases," he said, letting the statement linger. "The question isn't whether they exist, it's what we do about them. When we act on those biases, even unconsciously, we risk damaging the very trust that we're sworn to uphold." One officer, a younger man with a skeptical expression, raised his hand. "But what about situations where we have to act fast? Sometimes instincts are all we have." Marcus nodded, acknowledging the concern. "Instincts are important, but they're shaped by our experiences, and sometimes, by our biases. That's why training like this matters. It's about rewiring those instincts to align with fairness and justice. It's not easy, but it's necessary." The officer nodded slowly, his skepticism softening as he considered Marcus's words. Midway through the session, Captain Bennett entered the room quietly and took a seat at the back. She watched as Marcus engaged the officers, his demeanor calm yet compelling. He guided them through scenarios, encouraging open dialogue and challenging their assumptions. At one point, he paused to emphasize a critical point. "It's not just about avoiding mistakes," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. It's about building trust. Every decision you make, every interaction you have, either strengthens or weakens that trust. And trust, once broken, is incredibly hard to rebuild. The room grew heavier with thought as Marcus's words sank in. Officers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. For a moment, the weight of their shared responsibility hung in the air. As the session concluded, Marcus thanked the group for their engagement. Many stayed behind, approaching him with questions or comments. The younger officer from earlier lingered near the door before stepping forward. "Mr. Davis," he began hesitantly, "thanks for being upfront about all of this. It's not easy to hear, but it's important." Marcus offered a small, encouraging smile. The hardest conversations often lead to the greatest change. Keep asking questions. That's where it starts. As Marcus packed up his materials, Bennett approached him. "You've made an impact," she said simply. "I can see it in their faces." Marcus nodded, his resolve unwavering. "It's a start, but there's still a long road ahead." The precinct buzzed quietly as Marcus returned to Captain Bennett's office one final time. The air felt different, lighter, as if the department itself was slowly beginning to shift. The recent training sessions had ignited important conversations, and though the road ahead was uncertain, it was undeniably marked by progress. Captain Bennett looked up from her desk as Marcus entered, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You're becoming quite the fixture around here," she remarked, motioning for him to sit. Marcus chuckled, his demeanor relaxed but purposeful. "I hope that's a good thing." Bennett nodded, her tone thoughtful. "It is. Change is never easy, but your perspective is making a difference. I've seen it in how the officers are talking, questioning themselves, and each other. That's progress." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "Progress is good, but it's only the beginning. We can't let this be just another initiative that fades over time." Bennett met his gaze, her determination mirroring his. "Agreed. We've already started planning follow-ups for the training, regular workshops, mentorship programs, and new oversight measures. We're not just changing policies, we're working on the culture." The two sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their shared mission settling over them. Marcus finally spoke, his voice softer. "I've been in this field long enough to know that systemic change is a marathon, not a sprint, but moments like these, they remind me why it's worth it." Bennett smiled, a glimmer of respect shining in her eyes. "You've reminded me of that too." As their conversation wound down, Bennett handed Marcus a folder. "This is for you. A formal acknowledgement of your contributions and an invitation to continue working with us as a consultant. We want you involved in shaping the department's future." Marcus accepted the folder, his gratitude evident. "Thank you, Captain. I'm honored to continue this work with you." Later that day, as Marcus left the precinct, the cool evening air greeted him. He paused on the steps, glancing back at the building behind him. It was a symbol of justice, flawed but still striving to uphold its ideals. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of hope. As he walked toward his car, Marcus spotted Officer Harkins standing by the entrance, his posture hesitant. Their eyes met, and Marcus stopped. There was no animosity in his expression, only quiet understanding. "Mr. Davis," Harkins began, his voice tinged with uncertainty, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything." Marcus regarded him for a moment before replying, his tone measured but sincere. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step. What matters now is what you do next." Harkins nodded, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his reflection. "I'll do better," he said simply. With that, Marcus turned and continued to his car. The encounter lingered in his mind, a small but significant step toward reconciliation. As he drove away, the city lights blurred into a kaleidoscope of colors, reflecting the complexities of the world he had dedicated his life to improving.